Now, Russia and China, they do this every single year. They have a series of naval drills, and now they are coordinating between their air forces, in particular strategic bombers. And I just want to show what's been going on, because these bombers, Chinese and Russian bombers, have been flying in their operation. I believe this began on July 24th, 25th. I'll just play a short video. I'm going to play it on mute because I cannot stand the jet noise. It's only a few seconds, so that's really relevant. So here's some Russia Ministry of Defense footage, and then there's a really interesting and strange message at the end that I'll stop there, and then we'll play Lloyd Austin's response. So here is the footage. According to the United States, they intercepted these bombers, whatever that's supposed to mean in this sense. But they did not enter sovereign airspace of the United States or Canada. But it is the first time that strategic bombers from China and Russia, who they're calling U.S. adversaries. And look at this. I don't know who made this video, but they said, war is not the way for China and Russia. I find that to be incredibly ironic. But I now want to play Lloyd Austin's brief response to this, because, while he does attempt to speak confidently, I think, there's a lot of hedging around conflict with China and Russia, and, of course, the realities that such a conflict is not as easy as maybe it might have been in the past.
Regarding the Russian and Chinese aircrafts that flew together in the north here recently, this was not a surprise to us. We closely monitored these aircraft, tracked the aircraft, intercepted the aircraft, and which demonstrates that our forces are at the ready all the time, and we have very good surveillance capabilities, and of course I won't discuss any intelligence issues here at the podium, but again, it's the first time that we've seen these two countries fly together like that. They didn't enter our airspace. I think the closest point of approach was about 200 miles off of our coast. So, but this is a thing that we track very closely. We're able to intercept, and if it happens again, if there's any kind of a challenge from any direction, I have every confidence that Northcom and NORAD will be at the ready and will be able to intercept.
So that's what's going on. This happens when it comes to naval drills. This happens whenever Russia and China cooperate in any kind of way. There's always this scare that Russia and China are readying for war with the United States. But the reality is that as Lavrov and Wang Yi talking at the ASEAN Foreign Ministry Summit, they're talking about a new security architecture. But Ben, is this a security architecture for a war against the United States, or is it something else?
I mean, it's such nonsense. Again, this is what we were talking about earlier, how the Western media and Western governments, because of course the Western media, it simply regurgitates what Western governments say. They constantly say that China is 1 week away from supposedly invading Taiwan, blah, blah, blah. The reality is the exact opposite. I don't know the Russian perspective as much. I mean, I know it through the media, reading Russian media and such. But as someone I normally live in China, I'm currently in Nicaragua for a few months, but I'm going to be back in China in September. And I talked to so many people in Chinese universities and Chinese think tanks and Chinese former officials and such. And I've learned a lot about how they think. They're not in any way planning for war. They don't want war. On the contrary, if you ask what Chinese officials are thinking about, they'll say very clearly, one, we ended extreme poverty, but we want to continue developing because many people in China, especially in rural areas, still have very low incomes. We want to raise their incomes and create common prosperity. We want to increase the development in less developed regions, like, for instance, the rural areas, the Western provinces, They want to better integrate China. They want another huge concern that they're very focused on is more technological sovereignty, so they're not dependent on importing more advanced manufacturing products like semiconductors. They want to create their own sovereign technology so they can create not only their own airplanes, which they've been doing, but they can use local parts to create those airplanes. These are the kinds of things that people in China are focused on. They're focused on trying to bring down real estate prices without causing a major, crisis in the economy. They're focused on trying to raise employment for young, educated people. They're trying to decrease inequality. That's what occupies the vast majority of Chinese officials' time. They're not just sitting around thinking, all right, next week is perfect to invade Taiwan. This is just a complete fantasy that the Western media has fabricated to justify Western aggression against China. If you listen to what Chinese officials say in both public and private, they're very clear about it. They say, time is on our side. We're not worried about wanting to invade Taiwan or any of this nonsense. What we want to focus on is what they're doing, is increasing more interchange between the mainland and Taiwan province, making it easier for people to travel from the mainland to Taiwan province, increasing trade and economic interchange. And their view is that over time, the force of economic inertia, momentum will push toward deepening integration and reunification. They don't want a war. It's the US that is pushing for this. I mean, if you actually spend time in mainland China and you talk to Chinese people, average people, policymakers, intellectuals, academics, researchers, you start going crazy when you listen to what they say and then you read the Western media. It is completely fake. Completely fake. They do not want a war. It's the last thing they want. First of all, they see the people in Taiwan as their brothers and sisters. They're all part of China. The last thing they want is a war against their brothers and sisters. There are so many families in mainland China who have family members living in Taiwan province, and vice versa. People on Taiwan Island who have family members living in mainland China. This is, again, it's just such a fantasy. So China, of course, is doing what it can to defend its sovereignty, prevent extremist secessionist forces in Taiwan from trying to cause a war. And of course, they only represent a small minority. If you interview people on Taiwan Island, and there have been polls done by mainstream Western firms, they show that the vast majority of people on Taiwan Island want the status quo. They do not want independence. A small minority of people want independence. They want the status quo, to go along with things as they are. And if you talk to people in mainland China, they know that time is on their side, which is why extreme hawks in Washington and extreme secessionists in Taiwan, they're the ones who want war because they know time is not on their side. They know that in the decades to come, the mainland and Taiwan will come closer and closer together. So that's their concern. That's why we see so much of this propaganda. But it's just like, you see these people like Gordon Chang, who have been saying literally for decades now that China is on the verge of collapse. China is going to collapse. The coming collapse of China.
I don't know if you've caught also Peter Zahan, who's big on the YouTube streets. He's the same. I mean, he literally goes on. He's like in the middle of the mountains somewhere in the United States, and he's like, okay, 10 minutes on why China's going to collapse. No proof, evidence, anything. And, it's eaten up, but continue.
The supposed coming invasion of Taiwan is exactly the same. It's always exactly 1 year away. It's always 1 year away. Next year, they say now it's going to be in 2025. Next year, it's going to be in 2026. In 2026, it's going to be in 2027. However, I will say there is a circumstance in which it will happen, which is some kind of crazy extremists in Taiwan declare independence in alliance with some hawks in Washington. And there are some crazy people in Washington who would try to pursue that. Someone like maybe if Mike Pompeo comes back in a second Trump term, they might try to do that. But honestly, if you actually read some of the internal reports of some of these think tanks in Washington or like the Rand Corporation, they know they've done war games. There are basically no circumstances in which they win. In the best circumstance, mainland China doesn't win, but Taiwan is destroyed. That's in the best case scenario, according to war games done by US think tanks. And they actually don't want that either, because one of the world's biggest semiconductor companies is TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, which the US is very heavily reliant on. And now through the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, the US is trying to bring some of those manufacturing jobs back to the US. And the US is actually giving billions of dollars of subsidies and loans to TSMC to make factories in the US, specifically in Arizona. They've talked about making 4 factories. But the irony is that it's been completely unsuccessful, because the US, through the neoliberal era, it's financialized its economy, it's deindustrialized, and you can't just rebuild that manufacturing base overnight. It's very difficult. They don't even have the skilled workers who know how to operate this machinery to make advanced semiconductors. So ironically, what we're seeing is that TSMC not only is building these factories in Arizona with billions of subsidies from the US government, but they're also having to send workers from Taiwan to Arizona. And then they get there and they're having horrible experiences living in the US and realizing how, in many ways, the US quality of life is horrible with healthcare and bad public education, all this stuff. So, I mean, the idea that they can just have a war and then they'll win it, they won't win it. They'll destroy Taiwan, which means they destroy the main source of the semiconductors, and they destroy any possibility they have of trying to build a military base on Taiwan, which is the US goal. That's the US goal, is to weaken China, divide the Chinese people, to put this thorn in the side of China, and it's to build a US military base on Taiwan, which is what the US had until the normalization of relations with China in the 1970s. And we have documents from the National Security Archive, and which is at George Washington University in DC, and they have declassified documents that prove that the US military had nuclear weapons stored on Taiwan Island up until the 1970s, and they were forced to take them out as part of the rapprochement. And we now know also that during the second Taiwan Strait crisis, we know this because of the documents that were leaked by the leaker of the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg, who recently passed away, a great hero in the fight against war and empire. He exposed how in the second Taiwan Strait crisis in the Eisenhower administration, the US military came very close to nuking mainland China using the nuclear weapons they had stored in their base on Taiwan, which were aimed directly at mainland China. They came very close to doing that. So that's why they want, once again, to turn Taiwan into what they refer to an unsinkable aircraft carrier for war on mainland China. And those are the only extreme scenarios in which China would be prepared for war. But again, China is trying to do everything it can to prevent war. They do not want war.
Yeah, and I think this is why it's important to also notice how China, as Lavrov and Wang Yi, foreign ministers of Russia and China, as they talk about new security architecture, they're not talking about military alliances. They're not talking about how do we build up the bilateral, multilateral military capacity to wage a war. What they're really talking about is how do they deter any kind of potential war. And in that sense, when China not only, because China does and is investing in its military, and of course we know Russia has been doing so heavily because it is literally at war with NATO. They are saying that an alliance is not really necessary, because as long as they build up the capacity to protect their own sovereignty, really any kind of coordination militarily is all about that. It's all about keeping actual peace. It's like literal and real deterrence that not only military strategists talk about, but what people who talk about international law and talk about, what is appropriate militarization, what is appropriate defense. It's hard for people in the United States, I think, and the collective West to understand this, because their governments and their militaries are not building up any kind of defense. They are building up offense. They're building up wars. But any comments on that? Because a lot of people who follow our work, I know, really, anytime they view Russia and China conducting any kind of military cooperation, talking about security, they're always hoping, almost in some ways, I understand it, that a military alliance is going to be formed, because I think that people see in that, well, if a military alliance is formed, then the multipolar world is completely protected, and there's, and the danger will recede from the unipolar world side. But and your final comments on this before we...
Yeah, a few thoughts. You raised some good points, Danny. First of all, China's foreign policy, you have to understand, comes really out of the non-aligned movement. Technically, China was not part of the non-aligned movement formally, but China has always been very, linked to it. And China is also linked to the G77, which grew out of the non-aligned movement. It's the group of 77, which today actually has around 140 countries. They represent the vast majority of the world. And in their meetings, they always have summits, and they're called G77 plus China. Now, when I say that, what I want to emphasize is that when we think about the first Cold War, of course, we think about the US-led imperialist bloc, the Soviet-led socialist bloc. You have NATO, which was created first, and then the Warsaw Pact was created in response to NATO, specifically in response to the US incorporating Germany into NATO, which not only enraged Russia, which was the leader of the Soviet Union, but also was a security threat to the Soviet Union, right? So today, Russia does have some security alliances. For instance, President Putin visited Pyongyang and signed a security pact with the DPRK. Very important, very historic. China, on the other hand, has always had a much more non-aligned approach, and China is very careful about formal alliances. So China and Russia have made it very clear. They literally have said this multiple times. They have the best relations in their history, the best relations they've ever had. They said it's as strong as a rock. Everything. It's better than a friendship, all of these things, right? But it's technically not a formal alliance. Why is that? For a variety of reasons. Again, China is very hesitant about getting involved in foreign conflicts, and it could also, in some ways, jeopardize their security, not strengthen their security. Why do I say that? Well, take an example like this. People say China and Iran should sign a security pact. Well, what that means is that what if the US starts a war on Iran? Then that means they would force China to get involved, which means you immediately have World War III. Now, obviously, if there's some kind of war with Iran, it could easily go to World War III, even if there's not a formal China-Iran defense pact. But you can see that signing a security pact does not necessarily make you more secure. It could actually make you less secure. And China does not want war. Again, this is something that's the Western countries that have been at war for centuries, it's so deeply embedded in the political system. These are colonizing imperialist countries. China has not been at war, excluding some border disputes, really since the 1970s, with what was essentially an extension of the US war in Vietnam, which ended up spilling over into China. And there was, unfortunately, a very brief war between China and Vietnam. But aside from that, China has not really been at war since the Korean War, since the 1950s. And China wants to keep it that way. And by not engaging in a formal security pact, they see that as one of the best ways to, ironically, to maintain their security, because then they only have to concern about their own direct security concerns, right? And another way that we should think about this, which is very important, is I think Vietnam and China, despite their political disputes, they have very similar ways of approaching foreign policy. Now, there are some very ignorant people who claim that because Vietnam has good relations with the US, that Vietnam's allying with the US against China. That's not true in any way. You know this, Danny. You've been to Vietnam. You've explained this very well in your videos. That's not what's happening. Vietnam has a non-aligned policy. They also do not join formal alliances with other countries because they see that as the best way to maintain their security and their independence. China pursues a very similar policy. So they also have very good relations with Vietnam, by the way. And people talk about how Vietnam upgraded its relations with the US to a partnership, whatever. But actually, they already did that with China years before. So despite the fact that Vietnam does have good relations with the US, they have even better relations with China. So, I mean, they try to have good relations with everyone because they want to focus on economic development, lifting their people out of poverty, developing their infrastructure, developing their technology. The same thing in China, because they have socialist governments that don't want war. They're not worried about imperialism, like they don't, in the sense that they don't want to be empires. They don't want to extract the capital of foreign countries, and they're not worried about foreign capital accumulation. They're worried about local domestic development. They're not imperialist economies. They're focused on development. So when people talk about why China doesn't form a security alliance with Russia, etc., because they don't do that with anyone. I mean, I think probably Russia would like that because they already did one with the DPRK, and maybe the situation will become so dangerous with the U.S. aggression, especially if NATO continues to expand and South Korea and Japan are officially incorporated, and the Philippines is incorporated. Maybe China will be forced to sign a larger security agreement. But the reality is that if it's up to China, they want to keep it the way that it is, which is they have very good relations with Russia and very good relations with Iran and other countries, but they're not forced into a formal security pact.
Yeah. Yes, that's 100%. You know, on the Vietnam question, you know, going to Vietnam and China is very interesting because Vietnam feels like probably where China felt like it was maybe in the 80s and 90s, growing rapidly, but still very underdeveloped and still with a long way to go in terms of building up the productive forces and addressing some pretty basic problems. And that means Vietnam has said, no, we are not going to choose any kind of sides, regardless. And in some ways, I'm like, well, if you just lean a little more toward China, some of these issues that you have domestically in terms of economic development might, might resolve, especially around infrastructure. But, you know, at the same time, it also helps to not have the United States sanctioning you, which is what happened to Vietnam for all the way up until the end of the Cold War, a little bit afterwards. So, you know, there's that. And then I don't believe China, you know, my position, and we can close, and, you know, I'll just go over super chats really quick. My position is that China and Russia don't really need to form a military. As you said, maybe they might have to, but they don't really need to because they're neighbors, so they can cooperate. They have the terrain. They can, you know, they can conduct these drills like they were doing close to the Alaska border, but really it was totally within the parameters of international law. So they can do these things. They can conduct naval. They can cooperate where it's necessary because they do have joint security interests, but they don't have to form an alliance because, you know, that would mean, as you said, Ben, they would have to go into Ukraine. They would have to, you know, they would have to make Russia's problems their own. They would have to make Iran's problems their own. And I don't think the other side wants that either. Iran, Russia, it creates more problems than it resolves for right now. But I think I think we can see the architecture, the global security initiative that China has. We can see Russia and how it's navigating its own security situation regionally and globally. I think it all points to they're not unaware of the threats. but they're moving as delicately as possible to prevent what is the unthinkable. I think at the end of the day, a lot of geopolitical questions for the multipolar world ends up, being how far can we go before the unthinkable, is very real, because the United States and its allies, if we can call them that, they've brought us to this point.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyHaiFong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.